Three Messerschmitt fighters close from above. A lone hurricane staggers through the Channel sky, engine coughing, hydraulics weeping red fluid. The squadron expects him to brake left, to dive, to do anything a pilot with survival instincts would do. But Silas Crane does something that violates every combat doctrine in the manual. He pulls back the throttle. He slows his fighter to the edge of a stall. The German pilots overshoot, their attack pattern dissolving into chaos as physics betrays their expectations. What happened next would be written into RAF gunnery training for the next 80 years. Kent, 1940. The sky above the Channel is not glorious. It smells of cordite and leaking coolant. The heat inside a Hawker Hurricane at 18,000 feet turns the cockpit into a coffin of riveted metal. Radio chatter crackles with clipped voices and suppressed fear. Below, the English countryside stretches green and deceptively peaceful, dotted with the black scars of crashed aircraft. This is 601 Squadron, operating under fighter command. They fly standing patrols over the coast with no room for mistakes. If your engine fails, you glide. If you glide, you pray you make the airfield. The Luftwaffe controls the initiative, and their Bf-109s are faster, more heavily armed, and flown by veterans of Poland and France. British fighter squadrons are bleeding pilots at a rate that keeps Air Ministry planners chain-smoking through the night. The arithmetic is merciless and clear. Every scramble costs machines and men. Replacements arrive daily, wide-eyed boys with 30 hours in type. Some last a week, some last a single mission. Into this furnace walks a pilot named Silas Crane. He does not look like a fighter ace. Tall, angular, with wire-rimmed glasses that slip down his nose in the cockpit heat. Cambridge had not prepared Silas Crane for the smell of aviation fuel at dawn, or the way leather flight gloves made his hands sweat through the palms. The university had given him a fellowship in theoretical physics, a quiet office overlooking the cam, and the kind of intellectual respect that evaporates the moment you put on a uniform. He'd published 2 papers on ballistic trajectories before his 24th birthday. The Royal Air Force didn't care about either of them. The nickname started his second day at the dispersal hut. He'd been reviewing wind correction charts when Flight Lieutenant Miller leaned over his shoulder, breath thick with yesterday's whiskey, and said loud enough for the entire room to hear, "Look at Four Eyes here, studying for his exams." The laughter came quick and sharp. Someone else added, "Professor," and it stuck like oil stains on cotton. By the end of the week, half the squadron had forgotten his actual name. Silas didn't help his case. While the others played cards or talked about women they'd met in London, he sat apart with his slide rule and notebook, calculating optimal firing solutions for deflection shooting. The mathematics were elegant. A Bf-1009 traveling at 350 miles per hour requires you to aim not at where it is, but where it will be in the half-second your rounds travel through space. Lead the target, account for gravity drop, factor your own velocity vector. It was physics, pure and simple. Miller called it cowardice dressed up in numbers. "You can't think your way through a turning fight, Professor," he'd said one evening in the mess, jabbing a thick finger at Silas's chest. "When a Jerry's on your 6, you don't pull out a bloody calculator. You react, you fight." The rest of the pilots nodded agreement. They believed in instinct, in the kind of raw courage that didn't need equations to prove itself. Silas believed in precision. The gulf between them widened with every sortie he flew, every target he didn't fire at because the geometry was wrong, every combat report that read, "No enemy destroyed," while Miller added another kill marking to his fuselage. They thought the war would prove them right. Silas knew it would prove mathematics indifferent to opinion. The briefing room smelled of stale tobacco and mildew. Squadron leader Davies stood at the front, pointing to a chalkboard covered in crude diagrams of enemy formations. Behind him, 20 pilots sat in various states of attention. Miller had his boots up on the chair in front of him. Others were half asleep. Silas sat in the back row with his notebook open. Davies was talking about pursuit curves, though he didn't call them that. He called them getting on the bastard's tail and giving him what for. The squadron laughed. Silas didn't. After the briefing, Davies pulled him aside. Crane, you're burning ammunition like we've got factories running overtime. 3 sorties, 400 rounds expended, 0 kills. Want to explain that? Silas pushed his glasses up. I'm waiting for geometry to align, sir. Geometry? Davies's face was unreadable. Explain. So Silas did. He pulled out his notebook and drew it out in clean lines and numbers. A Browning .303 round travels at roughly 2,440 feet per second. A Messerschmitt Bf 109 at combat speed covers 513 feet per second. If you're firing from 250 yards away, your rounds take approximately 3/10 of a second to reach the target. In that time, the enemy aircraft has moved 154 feet forward. You don't aim at the aircraft, you aim at the empty sky ahead of it. It's called deflection shooting. You're not hunting where the bird is, you're hunting where it's going to be. Davies stared at the numbers. And you're calculating all this while someone's trying to kill you? The mathematics don't change under pressure, sir. Only the variables. Word spread. By evening mess, Miller was holding court at the center table, mimicking Silas's voice in a nasal whine. Oh dear, I can't possibly shoot at the Jerry. The angle is 3 degrees off optimal. The room erupted. Someone threw a bread roll. Silas ate alone, as usual. He didn't expect them to understand. Deflection shooting wasn't instinct. It was architecture. You built the shot in 3-dimensional space, accounting for velocity, trajectory, and gravity. Most pilots pointed their nose at the enemy and hoped. Silas refused to hope. Hope was a variable he couldn't quantify. But the .303 rounds in his guns, those followed laws as old as Newton. Aim where they will be. Lead the target. Let physics do the killing. The squadron thought he was overthinking it. Silas thought they were dying because they refused to think at all. If you believe intelligence should be respected and not mocked, hit subscribe. Only the narrow-minded and the bullies will scroll past. The confrontation came on a Tuesday night when the rain hammered the tin roof of the mess hall and made conversation difficult. Silas was eating alone at the corner table, his dinner tray pushed aside to make room for a stack of papers covered in trajectory calculations. The room was loud with voices and the clatter of cutlery. Someone had a radio playing dance music from the BBC. Miller's shadow fell across the table first, then Miller himself, smelling of engine oil and aggression. He had 3 other pilots with him, all wearing the same expression of barely contained contempt. Miller picked up one of Silas's papers, held it up to the light, and let it drop back onto the table. "Tell me something, Professor." Miller's voice put through the ambient noise. The room began to quiet. "How many Jerrys of your equations killed?" Silas didn't look up. "The same number your instincts will kill when they finally fail you." The mess hall went silent. Miller's jaw tightened. He pulled out the chair across from Silas and sat down hard, leaning forward with his forearms on the table. "You think you're clever. You think because you went to Cambridge and can scribble numbers on paper that you're somehow better than the rest of us. I think mathematics is indifferent to rank and ego." "Mathematics," Miller spat the word. "You know what wins fights up there. Blood, guts, the will to turn inside the other bastard and hold your nerve while the world goes gray. That's not in your books, Four Eyes." Silas finally looked up, meeting Miller's eyes through the lenses of his glasses. "Your blood and guts won't help you when you're firing at empty air because you don't understand ballistics. Bravery doesn't bend the path of a bullet." Miller stood abruptly, his chair scraping back. "We're going up tomorrow. Big raid expected. When the shooting starts, your slide rule won't save you. Let's see what your precious equations are worth when there's 109 on your tail and nowhere to run." The room watched in silence as Miller walked away, his entourage following. Silas returned to his calculations, but his hand was steady only through conscious effort. The challenge had been issued: books against blood, mathematics against instinct. Tomorrow would prove one of them obsolete. Silas suspected it wouldn't be the mathematics. Dawn came cold and gray, the kind of morning that made the channel look like hammered steel. Silas walked to his Hurricane while the rest of the squadron was still in the briefing hut. The aircraft sat in its revetment, rain beating on the doped fabric of the wings. The ground crew had fueled her, armed her, and pronounced her fit for combat. Silas had other preparations in mind. He pulled a white grease pencil from his flight suit pocket and climbed onto the wing. The cockpit canopy was clear perspex, slightly scratched from debris and wear. Perfect. He opened the canopy and leaned inside, bracing himself against the seat, and began to write. The equations came from memory. Velocity vectors in the upper right quadrant, gravity constant and bullet drop calculations along the left edge, deflection angles for targets at 90 degrees, 60 degrees, 45. He wrote small and precise, transforming the transparent canopy into a reference sheet of death. Each number was a tool. Each formula was a weapon. "What the hell are you doing to my aircraft?" Silas looked down. Sergeant Booth, the crew chief, stood below with his hands on his hips and his face the color of a bruise. Two other ground crew members had stopped their work to stare. "I'm preparing for combat," Silas said, continuing to write. "You're defacing RAF property with bloody arithmetic. I'm optimizing my firing solutions." Silas finished a particularly complex calculation for high deflection shots and climbed down from the wing. "The canopy provides an optimal heads-up reference point. I won't need to look down at notes." Booth moved closer, examining the white scrawl across the glass. "This is insane. You can't see through half of it now." "I can see through the parts that matter. The rest is information." By the time the squadron arrived for the scramble, word had spread. Pilots gathered around Silas's Hurricane, pointing and laughing. Miller pushed through the crowd, took one look at the canopy, and shook his head with theatrical disgust. "Unbelievable. The professor's turned his cockpit into a classroom." "At least I'll know what I'm aiming at," Silas said, pulling on his leather helmet. "You'll know exactly how you died, blinded by your own bullshit." The klaxon sounded across the airfield. Scramble. The laughter died instantly, replaced by the mechanical efficiency of men running to their aircraft. Engines coughed to life. Propellers bit the air. Silas settled into his seat, surrounded by his equations, and felt something close to calm. The sky would be his examination room. The Luftwaffe would be his test. Comment, "I stand for Silas." If you're tired of people who think they can bully their way through life, don't side with the bricks of the world. September 15th, 1940. The date would be carved into history books and memorial stones, but on that morning it was just another Sunday with clouds stacking over the channel like gray fortifications. The radar stations at Rye and Dover began reporting contacts at 0930 hours. Not the usual morning probe, something bigger. The plots kept multiplying on the operations room table until the WAAF plotters were moving so many markers they looked like croupiers at a deadly casino. 200-plus bandits inbound, then 300. The numbers made no sense until they did. This was the Luftwaffe's full commitment, the knockout blow they'd been building toward for weeks. Every available bomber from Luftflotte 2 and 3, escorted by every fighter that could get airborne. The objective was simple and brutal. Burn London until Britain sued for peace. At the dispersal hut, Squadron Leader Davies read the initial report twice before speaking. His voice was level, but his hand shook slightly as he lit a cigarette. "Gentlemen, this is not a drill. We're scrambling the entire squadron. Intercept over Maidstone, Angels 20. They're throwing everything at us." Silas checked his wristwatch out of habit, though time had become abstract the moment the phone rang. He walked to his Hurricane with the same measured pace he used crossing the quad at Cambridge. Other pilots were running, shouting to ground crew, their movements sharp with adrenaline. Silas carried his slide rule in his left hand. Miller saw it and laughed without humor. "You're actually bringing that thing?" "I'm bringing precision," Silas said, tucking it into the map case beside his seat. The engine start was a symphony of mechanical violence. 12 Merlin engines hammering to life, their exhausts spitting blue flame. The smell of high-octane fuel thick enough to taste. Silas ran through his checks with ritual precision. Fuel mixture rich. prop pitch fine, trim tabs neutral, gun sight illuminated. His eyes moved across the equations on his canopy, confirming each equation, each constant. The radio crackled. All Redcap aircraft, scramble, scramble, scramble. Throttle forward. The Hurricane surged down the grass strip, tail lifting, and then the ground fell away. The squadron formed up in loose VIX, climbing southeast into a sky that held 400 German aircraft and the future of the nation. Silas adjusted his glasses and began calculating angles of attack. They saw the bomber stream first. Dornier 17s in tight formation at 18,000 feet, their glass noses glinting in the weak sunlight. Heinkel 111s stacked above them. The formation stretched for miles, a mechanized river of aluminum and death flowing toward London. From this altitude, they looked almost beautiful, almost clean. The illusion lasted exactly 4 seconds. "Snappers high!" The radio call came from Red 2, his voice climbing an octave. 9 o'clock high, coming down." Silas looked left and up. 20 Messerschmitts Bf-109s dropping out of the sun like hawks, their yellow noses bright against the gray clouds, the classic bounce. Get altitude, get position, get the kill. Textbook Luftwaffe fighter tactics. Miller's voice cut through the radio chatter. "All Redcap aircraft, hard left, engage the fighters, break now." The squadron scattered. Silas watched the tactical situation decompose in real time. Miller was leading them into the turning fight, trying to meet the German fighters head-on with aggression and instinct. Every pilot followed him because that's what fighter pilots did. They followed their flight leader into the chaos. Except Silas had seen the second group. They'd come from below and behind, climbing out of the cloud layer at 15,000 feet, another 20 Bf-109s, throttles wide open, using the distraction of the high bounce to position themselves perfectly. The sandwich maneuver. Trap the enemy between two elements, force them to choose which threat to face, and kill them while they're confused. "Redcap leader, snappers below. They've boxed us in." Silas kept his voice level despite the ice forming in his chest. Miller didn't acknowledge. He was already committed, already turning hard left to engage the high Germans. The rest of the squadron followed, their Hurricanes pulling contrails in tight spirals. They were doing exactly what the Luftwaffe wanted. The first Hurricane died at 10:14 hours. Red 3, a kid named Pattison who'd been with the squadron for 6 days. A burst from below stitched his fuselage from tail to cockpit. The Hurricane nosed over and went down trailing smoke and pieces of fabric. No parachute. The second went 10 seconds later. Red 5 caught fire, the pilot screaming over the radio as the flames ate through his canopy. He rolled inverted and bailed out, his parachute streaming but not opening properly. Miller was still shouting commands, still trying to turn inside the high Germans. His instincts told him to close with the enemy, to get his gun sight on target, to fight. Those same instincts were blind to the mathematical reality that he was trapped in a kill box with converging fields of fire. Silas made a decision. He rolled inverted, pulled the stick into his lap, and dove away from the formation. The negative G's lifted him against his straps. His stomach tried to climb through his throat. The equations on his canopy blurred as the aircraft accelerated downward. Miller's voice crackled over the radio, raw with contempt. "Four Eyes is running, bloody coward!" Silas wasn't running, he was calculating, and the mathematics of survival had just become very simple. Hit subscribe if you've ever been the underdog. Only the trolls and gatekeepers want to see the genius fail. The dive gave Silas 3 things: speed, separation, and time to think. The Hurricane screamed through 8,000 feet with the airspeed indicator needle climbing past 300 knots. The fighter shuddered, protesting the velocity, but held together. Above him, the dogfight continued, a tangle of aircraft and tracer fire turning the sky into a geometry of death. Below him, untouched and steady, the bomber stream continued toward London. Silas pulled out of the dive at 5,000 feet, his vision tunneling briefly as the blood rushed from his head. He leveled off beneath the bomber formation, invisible to their gunners, and began the stalk. His eyes moved between the targets ahead and the equations on his canopy. The white grease pencil marks were his cathedral, his scripture, his proof. 3 Dornier 17s flying in a tight Vic formation. Range 400 yards and closing. Their speed 220 miles per hour. His speed 280 miles per hour. Closing rate 60 miles per hour, which translated to 88 feet per second. Time to firing position approximately 18 seconds. Silas climbed gradually, positioning himself behind and below the trailing Dornier. The bomber's gunner never saw him. They were watching for threats from above and behind, not from below. Standard doctrine, predictable, fatal. He referenced the deflection angle formula on his canopy. At this range and speed, he needed to aim 1 aircraft length ahead of the target, not at the engines, not at the fuselage, at the empty air where the aircraft would be in 0.3 seconds. Silas centered the illuminated gun sight 1 length forward of the Dornier's nose and pressed the firing button. 8 Browning machine guns erupted in sequence, the recoil shuddering through the airframe. The Hurricane slowed perceptibly as 400 rounds per minute poured into space. The bullets arrived exactly where the Dorning was going to be. They tore through the cockpit canopy, shredded the pilots, and continued through the navigator's station. The bomber lurched, nosed over, and began its long fall to earth. No fire, no explosion, just physics ending a crew. Silas was already moving to the second target. The other 2 Dorniers hadn't broken formation yet. Bomber crews were trained to maintain position, to rely on mutual defensive fire. Another predictable behavior, another exploitable constant. He adjusted his attack angle, consulted his canopy calculations for a 30-degree deflection shot, and fired again. 3-second burst. The second Dornier's port engine disintegrated, pieces of cowling spinning away. The aircraft rolled left, collided with its wingman, and both bombers tumbled out of the sky locked together. 17 seconds, 3 aircraft, 0 wasted ammunition. The bomber stream began to break apart as panic spread through the formation. Silas climbed away, scanning for the next mathematical certainty. His radio crackled with overlapping voices. Someone was screaming about being on fire. Someone else was calling for help. Miller's voice was absent. Silas's hands were steady on the stick. His breathing was controlled. The equations on his canopy had not changed. Neither had the laws of physics. He had 8 more aircraft worth of ammunition and a sky full of targets flying in perfectly predictable patterns. The mathematics of warfare were simple. Account for every variable, eliminate uncertainty, execute with precision. War didn't care about bravery, it cared about accuracy. The 20mm cannon shell hit Silas's canopy at 10:27 hours. He never saw the Bf-109 that fired it. One moment he was lining up on another Dornier, the next his world exploded into crystalline fragments. The perspex shattered across the left side of his cockpit, taking half his equations with it. Shards embedded in his leather helmet. One piece opened a cut above his left eye, blood running hot down his temple and pooling behind his glasses. The Hurricane bucked as Silas instinctively jerked the stick. Wind screamed through the broken canopy, tearing at his face, making his eyes water. He could barely see. The remaining intact portions of the canopy still held fragments of his calculations, but they were incomplete now, interrupted by jagged holes where critical formulas had been. His radio crackled through the wind noise. "Redcap 4 to any Redcap aircraft. I'm hit bad. Engines losing oil pressure. Can't maintain altitude." Miller's voice, stripped of bravado, edged with something that might have been fear. Silas blinked blood out of his eyes and scanned the sky. He found Miller's Hurricane 3 miles east, trailing white smoke, losing height in a shallow glide. 2 Bf-109s were circling above him like sharks, waiting for the killing moment. The mathematics shifted in Silas's head. No canopy reference needed. He'd memorized every equation months ago. The glass had been a convenience, not a crutch. "Redcap 4, this is Redcap 7. I have you visual. Maintain heading 270. I'm coming up."
Silas pushed the throttle to combat power and climbed toward Miller's position. The two Messerschmitts saw him coming and turned to engage. Classic mistake. They committed to the new threat and abandoned their tactical patience. Silas calculated the deflection in his head while wind tore at his face. Lead angle 45 degrees, range closing at 120 feet per second. Fire in 3, 2, now. The first BF-109 took the burst through the radiator. Coolant vapor exploded from beneath the cowling. The pilot broke off, diving for home before his engine seized. The second German saw his wingman leave and reconsidered his odds. He rolled away and disappeared into cloud. Redcap 4, turn to 270 and maintain best glide speed. I'll guide you home. Miller's voice was quiet. Copy, 7. They flew together toward the coast, Silas flying escort while Miller nursed his dying Hurricane across the channel. No more insults, no more mockery, just two pilots trying to survive the mathematics of fuel consumption and glide ratios. The white cliffs of Dover appeared through the haze. Miller's engine seized half a mile from shore, but he made the beach, wheels up, the Hurricane sliding through sand and coming to rest near a pillbox. Silas circled once, saw Miller climb out of the wreckage, and turned for base. His canopy was ruins, his equations were gone, but the mathematics remained, perfect and unchanged, in the place they'd always been, inside his head. If you can't stand arrogant people who put others down to feel big, hit like. Let's show the bricks they're outnumbered. Silas brought the Hurricane in just before noon. The approach was textbook, despite the shredded canopy and the blood dried across half his face. He touched down on the grass strip with barely a bounce, rolled to the dispersal area, and cut the engine. The Merlin coughed twice and died. Silence rushed in to fill the space where violence had been. The ground crew reached him first. Sergeant Booth climbed onto the wing, took one look at the destroyed canopy and the blood, and went pale. "Christ, Crane, you're hit!" "Superficial." Silas pulled off his helmet and wiped his glasses on his sleeve. They were covered in blood spatter and canopy fragments. The aircraft took worse. Booth examined the Hurricane with the expression of a man counting his own mortality. Bullet holes stitched the fuselage. The port aileron was more holes than metal. The entire left side of the canopy was gone. The remaining perspex holding Silas's equations shattered into a spiderweb of cracks. Squadron leader Davies arrived as Silas was climbing down. Behind him came the intelligence officer with his clipboard and the station medical officer with his bag. Davies looked at the Hurricane, then at Silas, then back at the Hurricane.
"How many?" Davies asked. 5 confirmed. 3 Dorniers, 2 BF-109s. The intelligence officer wrote it down, his pencil scratching across paper. 5 kills in 1 sortie made Silas an ace. The mathematics were indisputable. Other pilots began landing. Their aircraft came in scattered, some trailing smoke, some with visible damage. Red section was 3 aircraft short. Miller's Hurricane was still on the beach at Dover. The butcher's bill for the day was written in empty revetments and silent dispersal huts. Davies pulled Silas aside as the medical officer dabbed at the cut above his eye. "Your deflection shooting, the calculated approach, I need you to write it down. Everything, every formula, every principle. Fighter Command wants it codified." They laughed at it yesterday. Yesterday we were losing. Davies lit a cigarette with hands that shook slightly. "Today, you proved mathematics can kill Germans more efficiently than instinct. That makes it doctrine." By evening, word had spread beyond the squadron. By the end of the week, Silas was lecturing to groups of pilots on deflection shooting and predictive gunnery. The equations that had covered his canopy were printed in training manuals. The four-eyed professor became the standard against which other pilots measured their technique. Miller returned to the squadron 3 days later, his arm in a sling, his Hurricane a write-off. He found Silas in the dispersal hut, working through a new set of calculations. They looked at each other for a long moment. "Thanks for the escort," Miller said finally. Silas nodded. The mathematics required no apology, and neither did he. Hit subscribe to confirm you aren't one of those people who hates on others for being different. Only the manipulators won't join our ranks.